Welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid. And without further ado, I'd like to bring in my colleague, this author, journalist, and a international personality. I got his Martin Sieff. Hopefully, we don't have any problems. How's it going today? I can't hear you. Hold on. I think they're blocking your microphone. It says cannot unmute your guest because your microphone is on your end is muted. So we'll wait for.
How is that? That should be fine now.
Yeah. How's it going today?
So far, so good, but the day is young and I'm Northern Irish, so bad things can still happen.
Well, there seems like a lot of bad things are happening for the Western world and the Western Empire. I was looking at Sputnik. I don't know if they pronounce it Sputnik or Sputnik.
I think either would be fine, probably, but go on.
Okay. Well, they were just talking about the U.S. dollar, and we know how much the U.S. military and the Western world depends on dollar hegemony for their wealth, their influence, and their power. And as the show started, I flipped to Sputnik News, and it has an article says growing use of yuan in Russia-China trade eroding dollar dominance. And we'll take a look at what the first one or two paragraphs says. It says de-dollarization has become a buzzword of late, with ways to sidestep the greenback via boosted trade in local currencies, such as China's yuan, a key item on the agenda of the recent BRICS summit. Furthermore, the dollar ditching debate has been fueled by the U.S. currency's precarious global position as prospects of a recession looms. Now, Martin, we know that the U.S. dollar is the lifeblood of the U.S. military, the U.S. empire, and even the Western world and its clout. Do you think that the United States has put itself in a conundrum, a catch-22, if you will, by abusing and misusing the dollar and alienating nation after nation with sanctions? And are we living in the blowback effect of those irrational, insane policies?
Yes. We are, Rashid. You've nailed it. And again, we always have already this going on joke between us. And it's true. I don't have to say anything. All I have to say is nod my head and give you a thumbs up because you've summed it up, man. You've defined it. That is the issue. Now, I can go and, do a dance on this now, and I happily will, for the audience. But you've already made the key point. And a further point is, I noticed a very eminent, I didn't even catch his name, but a very eminent, I think, Italian financier speaking to, right before you came on, and you had it on this channel.
Ingdahl, F. William Ingdahl from Germany.
Yes. Oh, he was brilliant. Absolutely. And he said that the United States economy is in such a mess that Jesus Christ himself could not save it. Now, I would not limit Jesus Christ that way. He could save it, but I would say, but the point is he's not going to because fools are left to suffer the consequences of their own actions. And as he pointed out, and as you pointed out, this is inevitable. The wonder is it has been so long in coming. First, our stupid, greedy, corrupt elites for more than 50 years now have allowed American industrial dominance, the greatest source of wealth generation in the history of the world, to be outsourced for narrow, cheap, short-term profits all around the world, but primarily to China. So even 20 years ago, the London Economist magazine, which is very liberal and free market and free trade, and Adam Smith and open borders and all this poisonous nonsense. I mean, this is the AIDS of society. AIDS destroys the ability of the body to defend the immune system, to defend itself against any infection. That's how, why anyone who gets AIDS gets a million horrific illnesses if they're not treated immediately afterwards. But we have been suffering liberalism, and Cato Institute and open markets and free trade are the aids of civilization and society. They destroy the ability of society to defend its industry, to defend its borders, to defend its own people, black, white, Asian alike, all of it. And China does not follow these policies. If you look at China's policies for the past 40 years, they are exactly the same policies the United States followed after the Civil War, when it was building for 60, 70 years, when it was building up industrial America, the most powerful industrial force in the history of the world. And in the past 50 years, our corrupt elites have stupidly thrown it away, and our intellectual middle class have been so stupid that they didn't raise a finger to object to it. No, they're in favor of it. You read Tom Friedman, you read the New York Times, you slit your own throat. You're intellectually respectable, you know you're a genius. And other people like you and me and working class people, black and white alike in this country and Hispanic, were always the ones who suffer. It's always the ordinary people at the bottom of the pyramid. And I suggested 20 years ago that we should outsource Thomas Friedman, that we should outsource all the pundits of the Washington Post and the LA Times and the New York Times and CNN. Because there are so many bright people there in Mexico and Latin America, across Africa. There are now 700,000 startup IT operations across Africa alone, let alone across Asia. Send it to India. India speaks English fluently. It has an enormous population, biggest population in the world, and their intellectuals, they still have a free press. They have a million different publications and that freely attack each other and attack the government and defend the government as well. They have free and open debate, which we have thrown away totally, except, of course, for the Red Pill Diaries and outlets like Rogue Radio and TNT Radio and all our friends. The great professor Edward Lozansky, who started life as a Soviet dissident and is now an American dissident, a very interesting life evolution, right? You must come on sometime. I mean, the two of you look so different, but on every fundamental issue, you're exactly on the same page. He said to me 9 years ago, the United States is turning itself into the Soviet Union, and they do not even realize they are doing it. Well, we have done it, and here are the consequences: a collapsing economy. At the same time, as you just pointed out, we have to lecture the world that we are superior to everyone else when we very clearly aren't. The world's greatest democracy in the history of the universe that the universe has ever seen should not have 100,000 people dying of fentanyl drug addiction and poisoning every year, yet we do. How perfect is that? Is this what we are trying to impose in Ukraine? Is it what we want to give Russia and China as our great gifts? Is this the shining city on the hill that those 17th century guys who turned a blind eye to slavery, let us always remember? But is this what they had in mind? Maybe it is, because I mean, there was cognitive dissonance there. They were hypocrites, right?
Right.
Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, and he keeps his own black children as slaves during his lifetime. Right? You know, how wonderful is that? You know, well, yay!
You know, when we're dealing with these people in America, excuse me, I think that as the collapse steamrolls and picks up steam, I believe they become more detached from reality, and they become more desperate. And I often quote Gerald Celente when he says, when people lose everything, they lose it. And I believe the policies that those people in office, in power, are enacting are desperate policies, because they see the ramifications of the policies prior to that, and thinking that they're making it better, they are making it 10 and 20 and 30 times worse. And they believe that they are wise enough to see through all of the chaos and darkness, when in reality, they're dumb as bricks, and they're helping to deconstruct the American empire. What have you to say on that matter?
What I always say to you, I agree with you 100%, Rashid. You've nailed it, man. You've said it. You mention a man who clearly is a mutual friend of both of ours. I greatly admire him, Gerald Celente, who sees this so clearly and saw it long before I ever did. I recommend to you and to your audience too, and I will happily share the contact information for her. There's a wonderful lady, the world's leading anti-nuclear weapons and anti-nuclear war campaigner and peace activist for the past 50 years, an Australian doctor, Polish family from Britain, settled in Australia. She's Australian to the core in all the very best senses of the word. They haven't lost their individuality and their freedom and their courage the way almost everybody in our country, God help us, appears to have done, at least in the public sphere. Dr. Helen Caldecott. She's published many books as well. And Helen got into the whole business of the dangers of insane dangers of nuclear power. Another big lie that it's clean. My God, it produces plutonium and radioactivity. It's the most lethal force in the history of the universe. And, you have all these middle-class kids, including my own, who've gone through colleges, who have one or two, or God help us, how many degrees, right? And they say, oh, it's wonderful, it's clean energy, only because it doesn't crap like any sensible organic animal does in our natural organic cycle, which is an inevitable and healthy thing. Keep hygiene, but let's stick with the carbon cycle, thank you. The plutonium cycle is lethal. The plutonium cycle is not good for us. Right? And either weapons or supposedly civilian nuclear power. It's insanely dangerous. And again, who falls for this poisonous nonsense? The most educated, the most arrogant, the most elitist.
Mm-hmm.
And George Orwell predicted this would happen. He said, if there is hope, it will come from the bottom of society. In 1984, the people who were dismissed as the proles, the people who did not take themselves seriously, who did not read serious intellectual books, who did not read the New York Times every day to find what they were supposed to think, so that Thomas Friedman alone could tell them. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're on much safer ground with Pope Francis than you are with Thomas Friedman. Thank you very much.
You know, as you were talking, I was just scanning the news and I was thinking about how the U.S. empire continues to eat itself up, from the inside out. And I was just thinking about this political circus that is going on right now, as they indicted Trump on fraud. And so this article says, U.S. judge finds Trump committed fraud by inflating wealth assets in New York civil case. Now, if that's the case and they want to hold him because he inflated his assets, then they would have to charge nearly 90 to 98% of all people living in America with fraud. And I'm trying to figure out why is nobody even mentioning this? Because there are times when people filled out credit applications, or there are times when people filled out a lease agreement for a car, a home, a boat, or whatever, and they've inflated their assets. That's the American way. That's the Western way. So why would they go after Trump? Is that a way to discredit him and to try to get something on him to keep him from running for president again?
You've just reinforced the analysis you already made earlier. Of course, you're right, completely, 100%. But you pointed out just there that the more their policies come into. I'm not a Marxist, never have been, loathe it. But Marx stole a lot of good ideas from Hegel, who was a genius. And Hegel talks about these inherent contradictions in the dialectic, that people follow contrasting policies at the same time. Freud would say, they're being schizophrenic, they're being self-destructive, and they're in a state of cognitive dissonance. Hypocrites are that never believe they're hypocrites. Hypocrites are the most righteous people in the world. It's always the rest of the world that's kind of, out of control around them. And this is what we see here again, exactly as you said. First of all, their policies are unsustainable and have already failed and are collapsing. They do not dare admit this to themselves.
Mhm.
So you have the situation where Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, goes to China, and my God, they wheel out Henry Kissinger at age 100 because he has the Chinese. They know the Chinese respect him personally, and they wheel him out. And I think Kissinger is smart enough to know better. But, by God, he built the system. So, he has to do what he can to keep it propped up as long as he's still here, which actually could be another 200 years. I mean, but the point is, they're desperate. Janet Yellen goes to Beijing. Please, please, President Xi, please, leaders of China, stop, dumping your U.S. Treasury holdings. Give us a breathing space. Yes, of course, we are threatening you with war. Yes, of course, we are trying to choke you in and choke you in the South China Sea. Yes, of course, Chinese Americans are being slaughtered in hate crimes as a direct consequence of the lies we are telling about them and about China. But we don't really mean any of it. Just keep buying our treasury bonds for another 6 months until we feel it's safe to start lying at you and setting up more missiles around and military bases around you again. And just be nice to us anyway. They do not see their own hypocrisy. They do not see the cognitive dissonance in this. No, it's the fault of China and it's the fault of Russians for acting in their own self-interest to try and protect their own countries from being dismembered. China was dismembered for 100 years as a direct result of British and French imperialism, and America made huge profits from that too. The great and sainted President Franklin Roosevelt, and I am in general a great admirer of President Roosevelt, but he made no secret about this. In this sense, he wasn't a hypocrite. Actually, he was, but he wasn't conscious of it. He favored an open door policy towards China. And his own family, he came from enormous inherited wealth. And how was the wealth made? It was made by his Delano grandfather selling opium to China, the fentanyl of the day, destroying Chinese civilization, destroying hundreds of millions of lives. And the British Navy and the French Navy and armies fought 2 wars in 1839 to 1842 and in 1859 to 1860. And they blasted open the doors of China when the Chinese governments of the day were trying to prevent this flood of drugs, of opium, which was produced in those days not in Afghanistan or in Mexico or in Colombia, but in British controlled India, and was being sold through Hong Kong for vast, vast profits. And all the Chinese government was doing was trying to save its own civilization and hundreds of millions of its own innocent people from dying of drugs and dying of famine because they were so, hundreds of million people were so drug addicted, they were not capable of doing any productive work anymore. Does that sound familiar in modern today? Because what went around has come around. It has already come around. Now, as you say, first of all, they have the gospel of free trade. You must not have tariff protection to protect your own industries, right? And as a result, everybody else, all our industry, as you pointed out, relocates to China and to other countries, but primarily to China. So the great source of wealth generation in the world has moved for the past 50 years from America to China. And that is why America cannot afford the military to be number 1 in the world anymore, because we do not, and that is why the dollar is collapsing, because we run hundreds of billions of dollars in trade deficits every year, because we have to import all our goods from China, because we cannot make them anymore. And these are the same geniuses who are saying, oh, woe is me, oh, woe is us now. And on top of that, you have these idiots in the Republican Party as well. Let's not just damn the Democrats, right? I mean, all the polls show that the American public, not in confidence or happiness, but in despair, thinks that the Republicans, idiots though they are less harmful to the economy and better for controlling crime and borders than the Democrats. Well, that's a very low bar they had to meet. And even then, the Republicans are so idiotic and stupid that they have to shoot themselves in both feet at the same time. First, on the abortion issue, which should be left to the states, And they're trying to impose this one-all-fits-all policy, which on social issues can, as prohibition showed, cannot work on a vast continental-sized nation the size of America. America has to be tolerant and inclusive because America cannot survive not being tolerant and inclusive. But there is an intelligent way to be tolerant and inclusive, as opposed to a crazed, now bang somebody over the head with the King James Version of the Bible. Remember the old saying, I believe in the King James Version of the Bible. It was good enough for Moses, and it's good enough for me. Well, no, Moses never read the King James Version of the Bible. He never read most of the Bible. At the most, he wrote the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible, if that, right? And but as other stuff comes later, but everybody just kind of gloms it all together. And they don't even glom it together the way it really is, which is a complex book with a lot of irony and contradiction and depth to it. No, you have a one-size-fits-all view. I mean, another lie. George Washington was not a Christian. Abraham Lincoln was not a Christian. These are the truths of the matter. Winston Churchill was not a Christian. Very actively so. They were free thinkers. There was one notorious event in the election of 1846 when Lincoln, who will do anything to pick up votes, even contradicts his own lifelong atheism and goes to a religious prayer meeting. And he's known as one of the most notorious free thinkers and agnostics in the state of Illinois. And the preacher, who is a real fundamentalist, bang 'em hard guy, right, recognizes them and says, is talking about how everyone will go to hell if they don't believe every word of the Bible, and not just Christianity, but Christianity the way he and he alone and his friends explain it, of course, right? And another wonderful heartland white American fantasy, right? And he says, are you going to believe me and go to heaven? Or are you going to be with all the sinners and burn forever in hell? Where are you going to go, Mr. Lincoln? And Lincoln replied, I don't know about you, Pastor, but I'm going to go to Congress. And another occasion when Lincoln is cutting deals with slavers because he needs white slave support to keep key states in the Union. And principled white opponents of slavery who take their Bibles and Christianity seriously in the best sense are criticizing Lincoln for this. What is his reply? I would like the good Lord on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Words that Mitch McConnell applies successfully to this day, right?
So we go to that cognitive dissonance.
Yes, exactly. So Janet Yellen goes to Beijing, and she's supposed to be one of the most brilliant financial minds in the world. And she may well be, because that would explain the mess the world is in. Right? Not just because she does it, but because all of them are worse than her. And she doesn't realize the cognitive dissonance, and neither does Joe Biden, in what they are asking the Chinese to do. We hate you. We teach our people to hate you. We are plotting war against you. We openly threaten you with war. Please bail out our stupid, worthless economic policies, because your economic policies are so much more prosperous. Please do it for us. And the Chinese, cynically, and to buy some goodwill and to buy some time, but under no long-term illusions, do so. But does that mean that the volume of hatred is the drive towards insane, aggressive war against a nation with 200 times our shipbuilding capacity, 4 times our population, 1,000 times the number of our engineers? And they want to pick a war with China? Are they insane? Yes, they are.
Yes, they are. They have to be. As I talk to other people that come on the show, and as I do live streams by myself, I pose these scenarios to people who are watching. Common sense tells me if my livelihood depends on Martin, and my mortgage is paid by Martin, and my car note is paid by Martin, and my food bill is paid, and my energy bills are paid by you, and the money that I get is from you for my family's livelihood, then common sense tells me not to antagonize Martin and go to his house and set up gun shops around his to wall him in with arms to tell him, listen, if you don't abide by my rules, then I'm going to shoot up your house. That is insane, because the entire civilization depends on the gratuity of China and the benevolence of China, because again, 93 to 95% of all goods in the United States come from China or a subsidiary of the Chinese nation. When they buy it from Cambodia, when they buy it from other places, all those things are products that were made by China and assembled in those nations, and they're shipped over here. And think about the situation. The United States is in a debt spiral, a debt crisis, the likes which no nation has ever heard before. It is the largest debtor nation in the world. And if China pulls its $1.2 trillion out of the U.S., then more so than China pulling its $1.2 trillion out of the U.S. would hurt the U.S., but it would cause a stampede by other nations out of dollar treasury, dollar-denominated assets, which would implode the U.S. dollar and implode the U.S. economy. So they have to be detached from reality. They have to be, to continue to antagonize the very nation that produces 93 to 95% of all goods, is its largest trade partner, largest investor, the largest manufacturer, and you come to me and say, buy my treasuries, and while the Treasury Secretary is in Beijing talking, the U.S. sends warships through the Taiwan Strait. How insane is that?
You've nailed it. I'm originally Irish, and the part of Ireland I'm from is part of Britain still. Half part of Britain, half out. Nothing Irish is simple, as you know. Everything Irish is weird and complicated. But I grew up in the aftermath of the fall of the British Empire. And the British made one insane, catastrophic decision after another over 100 years that lost them ultimately their empire. And like us, they had a rigid, arrogant, holier-than-thou educational system and culture, and they were too proud to learn from anyone else. But even they had a ruling class that was smarter than ours. And even when it took them till 1940, Hitler had to run all of Western Europe before the British woke up and finally said, "Oh, we thought we were running a quarter of the world. We were, we had the biggest empire in human history, bigger than ancient Rome, bigger than Genghis Khan, bigger than China or Russia. And all of a sudden, we're going to get our throats cut. How did that happen?" But then at least they woke up briefly. And Winston Churchill did exactly what you said. He knew the survival of the British people hung purely on the goodwill of the American people and of personally President Franklin Roosevelt. And he acted over time accordingly. He went to the most extraordinary degrees, quite literally. He encouraged basically all of his family to go to bed with the most influential American politicians and advisors to change the form of the United States government. His daughter, Diana, was the girlfriend of John Winant, ambassador to Britain from 1940 through to the end of late in World War II, or to the end of World War II. And poor Winant committed suicide when she dropped him like a hot potato after the war, because neither she nor her father nor the British Empire needed him anymore. Averell Harriman, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America and a strong supporter and advisor to President Roosevelt, had a hot and heavy long-term affair with Churchill's own daughter-in-law, Pamela Churchill, who became Pamela Harriman. She ended her incredibly long life 50 years later as a senior advisor and close friend to President Bill Clinton. This was one of these people who's just around forever, right? But her own husband, Churchill's son, Randolph, never forgave his father for encouraging his own wife to sleep with the visiting American special envoy. But Churchill didn't care. He was desperate to get on the right side of Roosevelt any possible way he could, even sacrificing his own family to do it. His own family. That's how ruthless and how focused he was. But he didn't even like President Roosevelt. And he's always cursing about him behind his back. And after FDR is dead, Churchill lies about him and steals his reputation. But at the time, he actually admits this. He says, no young lover ever was so concerned about the whims of his mistress before going to bed with her as I was on staying on the good side of President Roosevelt. Because of what you said, Rashid, because Churchill, who was a cynic, but a brilliant cynic, knew that the survival of his country and the British Empire depended entirely on American goodwill. And America gave it in spades. America saved Britain in World War II. Still does, has protected them to this day. But are we doing the same thing to China? We are in the same position towards China today that Britain was towards the United States of America. And yet, what are we doing? Like you said, we're surrounding them with gunshots and telling them we're going to burn their house down. This is insane. It is insane. I had a teacher more than 50 years ago at the University of Oxford, a wonderful man, Professor Hans Schenk, from the old Austrian and Czech aristocracy. He was so eminent, his grandfather had been the personal secretary to the heir to the Emperor of Austria, the guy who got shot at Sarajevo in 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That was my teacher's grandfather. And my teacher was an interesting man. He was a devout social democrat, and he was also a devout Catholic Christian at the same time. And he was under no illusion about how murderous and monstrous the Soviet Union was under Lenin and Stalin. But he also recognized that for the Western world to survive, they had to make common cause with the Soviets against Hitler and against the Nazis. And he's looking at the way the British government in 1939 is insulting Stalin and humiliating him. And in every little, the most petty little anal of ways. And he said, my teacher said to me in seminars, he said, Martin, even after all these years, I cannot explain it. Were they insane? And then he answers his own question exactly the same way you did, Rashid. Professor of European thought at the University of Oxford came to the same conclusion about Chamberlain you have come to about Janet Yellen and Blinken and Joe Biden. Yes, I suppose they were. They were insane, he said. Now, he wasn't on a radio show like us, and he wasn't a loudmouth Irishman like I am. So he said it in a quiet, gentle, academic manner. But it was the same conclusion. They had to be stupid. They had to be insane. It wasn't enough that they were wicked. Surely that too. But, I think I may have cited to you before, but there was a British member of the House of Lords, supporter of Churchill. He was a very sleazy individual. It emerged after, called Robert Boothby in the House of Lords, emerged after he died, that he was involved with organized crime, who supplied him with little, and I mean very young little boys for his tastes. So this was pure slime. But in politics, he was brilliant, and he actually supported Churchill in the 1930s. And 30 years later, looking back on the policies of the British government, remember, this was a very decadent guy saying this, right? He said, these people took the largest empire in the entire recorded history of the human race, and they brought it to the brink of this total destruction in only 10 years. And then he added, it took the Roman Empire 200 years of perfectly enjoyable decadence to reach the same result. Right? And again, we have done it again here. It isn't our decadence that has destroyed America. It's our incredible arrogance of our leaders and their stupidity. Their stupidity. Every nation in modern history has risen by building up its industry and exporting to other countries and making profits from it and protecting the jobs of its working class people and farming people at home by not letting other countries flood the market with cheaper goods, right? And once you abandon that policy like the British did in the 1870s, you go down the tubes very fast. And once we abandon that policy with universal free trade in 1960s and 70s, we have gone down the tube ever since very fast. And the only political leader who had the brains to stand up against this was actually Donald Trump. And there were a lot of negatives there too, to put it mildly. I am not going to deny that for a second. We could spend the next hour you listing them, and I will say, "Amen, brother," at every point, right? But he had been a businessman. And of course, the New York Times turds never got it. All of them and all my liberal friends say, "Oh, we mustn't have it, Trump. His economic policies will be terrible." Turned out it was the one, although he was dividing the country right, left, and center in every other way, that was the one thing he was very competent on. Why must we not have Trump? They said none of these people could run a business or set up an operation like yours to save their lives. They couldn't clean a latrine in a 7-Eleven if they had to do it with their tongues. It would still be beyond them. But how do they lecture Trump? "Oh, we mustn't have a guy who's declared bankruptcy 3 or 5 times as president of the United States." I said, "You idiotic fools. The United States government has been bankrupt ever since Lyndon Johnson's day. That is exactly what we need. We need somebody who has a lot of experience in declaring bankruptcy and getting away with it, and then setting up business again as if nothing has happened. Somebody totally shameless and cynical. Because that's the only way to keep the United States afloat, because we've been bankrupt for the last 50 or 60 years, and you're too stupid to see it, because you're beneficiaries of the bureaucratic policies that made the bankruptcy inevitable. Have we been spending money on the poor? No, it's all a con job. It's all a big lie. You know this. We spend money on weapons and armaments, and we spend money not to put poor people to work or create jobs for them, but to make them more dependent than ever at the most subsistence level. And a very key point, I wrote a book on this. You can still get it. I don't think anybody has bought it. I had to publish it myself. It's only available in Kindle, but get it on Amazon.com. Cycles of Change. It's Political History of the United States from Thomas Jefferson all the way through to Barack Obama. But I make the point the trade union movement for working class people, black and white alike in this country, flourished from the 1930s to the mid-1960s. And who killed that movement? Not the big bad conservatives, although they were happy to go along with it, but the wonderful enlightened Tom Friedman liberals. One in particular, Senator Edward Kennedy. Because in 1965, Kennedy passes the Unlimited Immigration Act for unlimited immigration from anywhere in the world into the United States, which is what Wall Street wants, which is what the billionaire wants, because it destroys every good-paying industrial job and agricultural job in America. You can break any trade union when you have unlimited labor coming across the border at any time that is ready to work for subsistence levels. You can have unlimited immigration into the United States, or you can have a strong trade union movement raising the standard of living of the American people, which it did from the 1930s to about 1970. But you cannot have both at the same time. You can argue every theoretical argument you like why it will work. It simply does not work. Argue to me. You can make mathematical cases, brilliant intellectual arguments, why all the water in Niagara Falls should flow uphill rather than down. But how does it flow? There was a guy called Simon Newhouse, I think, who was supposedly the most brilliant mathematician in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Of course, they thought the world of him at Harvard and Yale, right? And he proved mathematically in 1903 that heavier than air flight was not possible. The math was inevitable, he said. Of course, all you have to do is put wrong values to your mathematical figures. You'll come up with anything good or bad you like. No, but the genius could not see that. The article appeared in one of the major philosophical journals on the East Coast in 1903. Wilbur and Orville Wright had already flown their first aircraft before their article was even published, and they didn't know it. And they didn't have any degrees from Columbia or Harvard or Yale or Princeton. They made bicycles, and they watched early movies. So they knew how simple chains worked and how simple the earliest gasoline engines worked. And because of early photography, they could watch birds in flight frame by frame, which was never done before. So they could see how wings and feathers and warping works. And that's how one technological breakthrough goes to another. But they didn't work out this brilliant theory of free trade and prove that it works. Free trade is taught in every college in America, which is why America is bankrupt. And all the theories of management are shit. Because how many companies succeed in America? May I give one piece? And I managed the company not even brilliantly well. I just, I managed it well enough because I was in a management position. I was told, do this, do that, stay within budget, don't waste your money. If anybody's no good, or try fire them. Well, duh. That's basically what you need to do, right? And you've done it. But every company in America, every big corporation has human resources. NASA, the Army, God help us, Air Force, everybody has HR. Once you get HR, you ruin your own organization, big or small, whatever field you're in. Because who goes into HR? The losers, the assholes, the people who can't do anything else. And who do they approve of, and who do they hire and recommend that you hire for every key position? People just like themselves, and therefore they will fill your company with losers and mediocrities and assholes. You are a success in life, Rashid. Let me tell you how not to be a success. You become so successful, your company becomes larger, and all the bankers and investors who want to invest in you say, we'll invest in you, but you've got to be better organized. You have to set up an HR department. They're not consciously out to destroy you and bankrupt you. They're just going to do it because that's the kind of idiots they are. And everybody says, oh, yes, what a wonderful idea, HR. No, it will ruin your company every time. It has ruined your company every time. If you have one and you're struggling to survive, those are the people to fire. That's the first place to make sales. They're not productive, and they're filling you with losers.
And well, when we look at America and we look at the global standing, and I wanted to bring this point home as you were talking. I was like, oh yeah, I was taking in everything that you were saying, and I was thinking about how America and Britain and the European Union continue with insane policies, as just like you say, and then after they break something, they scream about it being broken. They don't take responsibility for throwing the glass jar on the floor. They get mad and scream about stepping on pieces of shards from the glass. And so when we look at that, for instance, let me give you an example. Muammar Gaddafi, he warned that if they overthrew him, that there would be a major influx of migrants into Europe. He warned Europe not to try to wage war and balkanize North African countries. And they got rid of Muammar Gaddafi, and there's an influx. I mean, everything that he warned them about is happening in Europe, and the European leaders are screaming about an influx of migrants when they destroyed the government, the leadership, the institutions that make government viable, and now the people that were not fleeing prior to the overthrow of those governments are now fleeing into Europe, which is putting undue economic pressure on the government and the actual citizens of Europe. And now they're screaming about migrants and vilifying migrants when it was government policies that initiated the influx of the migrants. Why don't anybody talk about the underlying effects of that? Because we know that illegal immigration and the migrant crisis is flooding Europe. But there is an underlying cause to that everybody chooses to ignore.
Fully agree with you, man. Absolutely. Again, you've nailed it. There is a wonderful, extraordinary, very quirky novel written about 60 years ago about the Russian Revolution. It's the only good novel about Russians I've ever read that was written by an English person, an English lady, a genius, Dame Rebecca West, an extraordinary lady, lover and mistress of H.G. Wells fathered his son and then became his bitter enemy for the next 40 years. It's very, very funny. Her son, who loved the father, she became a bitter enemy of him too, and he became a prime novelist as well. Covered the Nuremberg war trials as a war correspondent. I mean, she's a genius, and she's very entertaining. And she wrote a novel about the Russian Revolution called The Birds Fall Down in the 1960s. And this lady, who had always been on the far left of center, shows an amazing sympathy for the old Russian regime, because she said, compared with the incompetent and utterly genocidal communists who replaced them, inept and stupid and mad as they were, even they looked good compared to that, right? And there's one scene there where a young idealistic revolutionary is talking about the need to destroy the evil, corrupt czarist government and system and kill everybody in sight. And he's saying this to the former czarist minister of justice, an old czarist reactionary, an aristocrat. And he's saying, you know, this is in all the great philosophers. It's in Plato, it's in Hegel, it's, you know, it's in Marx. You know, you cannot disagree with all the greatest minds in history. And what does the wise old geezer say? Look at him and say, your father didn't beat you enough when you were a boy. That is the problem with our leaders following these mad policies today. Nobody beat them when they were boys and girls. Now, my parents were very doting and protective to me. They never raised a hand to me once, far from it. But it was my teachers you had to be careful about. And the rival gangs in the streets of North Belfast, you had to be very careful about. You knew you had to land your kick in the key place right the first time when you were 10 or 11 years old, and then run for a life, because you wouldn't get a second chance, and you'd probably survive, but you'd have a couple of broken ribs to show for it. Those were the neighborhoods I grew up in. And I was a quiet, shy little guy, right? But of course, I was Irish too, right? Now, these people have no sense of that. They were raised to be told totally fraudulently by their own doting parents that they were geniuses. And they go through Harvard and Yale and the like, and they're mediocrities. I did recently, I thought I'd sent it to you, but I may not have, a profile of Jake Sullivan. I wrote about him. This is not a man who was going with a golden spoon in his mouth, with a silver spoon in his mouth. He had a golden tureen right up his ass, right up his anus. This guy was a star student at Yale University and was the editor of its law review. He was a star visiting Rhodes Scholar and student at the University of Oxford in England and was the editor of its international review. He clerked for one of the most prestigious law firms in Wall Street in America. He was taken in his 20s as a senior advisor to Senator Amy Klobuchar, which explains why her political career went nowhere. He was one of Hillary Clinton's top political advisors in her 2016 campaign, which is why Donald Trump was no doubt able to beat her so easily when nobody gave him a chance, and he shouldn't have had a chance if she had been at all competent. The problem is not just that Sullivan is an idiot and that everybody thinks he's a genius. The problem is, who thinks he's a genius? People who are just as stupid as he is. They're all the same. We have a ruling culture that is more stupid than the Russian aristocracy before 1917, or the French Ancien Regime, the French old regime before the revolution of 1789. You've said it yourself, and again and repeatedly and so wisely. They haven't a clue the consequences of their own policies. They don't understand their own policies. They don't understand the backlash for their own policies. And they are totally incapable of taking personal responsibility for any of their own policies. They are totally incapable of saying, I was wrong. Not just I was wrong, because they say this and don't mean it. And then they continue with exactly the same policies.
Yep.
My wife, who is an IT engineer, is fond of citing an IT mantra till I'm blue in the face, but it's very wise. And it applies to human nature, of course, too, and human conduct. If nothing changes, nothing changes. Very often we're capable of changing ourselves. But even then, we find if we go to a different environment, this is the whole concept of the great Alcoholics Anonymous AA movement. It encourages people to join other people who have the same problem and mutually support each other. You create a nurturing environment and a new world, a new environment. These people stay in their old world. They stay in their old ideas, and they brainwash themselves that there are no alternative viewpoints that are legitimate or permissible. And that makes world war inevitable. That is why, even when we need China's help to survive, and why we have to convince the Russians we are not determined to commit genocide on them, as the ruling class now believes, and this is a major thermonuclear power. Something else I learned growing up in the streets of Belfast, and back there more, especially as a young man, as a young reporter, and more actually editor starting out there, but as a young journalist in Belfast in the 1980s, I learned to be polite to murderers. I learned when you met the heads of the local gangs, the local paramilitary organizations, people who ordered hundreds of murders, who tortured routinely, real psychos, you were polite to them. Now you smiled to them. You laughed at their terrifying jokes. It wasn't easy to do. Believe me, I would go home from meetings on behalf of, in the course of my work in the news business, and I would not go to bed for another 3 or 4 hours. I would watch Australian soap operas because that was the only thing showing on Irish television at that time. We didn't have multiple channels. We didn't have cable in those days. They had multiple choice, like we all take for granted now, because I was terrified to dream. To go to bed straight to dream after having to be just polite. These were not people who threatened me or ever used violence on me, but I knew what they were and what they had done and what they were going to do. And I and everybody else who survived to tell the tale, we knew enough to be polite to them. Now, if you're polite to just a local vicious thug like that, and you should be, how polite should you be to the rulers of Russia and China when they have thousands of thermonuclear weapons and ICBM delivery systems for them at their disposal? I would say you should be very polite indeed. You should be very respectful indeed. And yet our ambassador, an interesting connection here, and that is Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago. Yes, exactly. A totally corrupt tool of Wall Street, a man who gave back President Barack Obama such terrible advice that Obama was unable to capitalize on the greatest majority the Democratic Party had won in almost half a century, in 44 years since 1964, because Rahm Emanuel said, keep it for your second term. And of course, in the second term, he faced Republican control of the House and the Senate. And the moment which should have been at the beginning of his power was gone. The same man bankrupts the city of Chicago as mayor, leads it to the most. Al Capone was a much better ruler of Chicago than Rahm Emanuel. Chicago was a safer city for its ordinary people under Al Capone and Frank Nitti and the days of the Untouchables than it ever was under Rahm Emanuel. And now Joe Biden has made this genius our ambassador to Japan. And what is he doing? He is sending such embarrassing Twitter insults out against the president of China every day that even Joe Biden and Tony Blinken are embarrassed. And they've actually, and this has been reported in the Washington Press, I think in political newspaper, possibly The Hill. You know, we're trying to get these people to stop destroying the dollar. Please try and be polite to them, at least for a few months. He's so stupid. He can't even do that. And this is a man who sat on the board of Citibank. And how much trust should you therefore have in Citibank? But you have to escape Citibank, because Citibank and 3 or 4 other banks in America have swallowed every other bank in America and are too big to fail. We don't even have capitalism anymore with all its many imperfections. We have monopoly oligarchy. And it's not competent monopoly oligarchy.
Well, you know, as we talk about the detachment from reality. Do you believe that they, the ones who are in power, realize that we're at this moment, this inflection point in history where it's do or die, and every lever of power which used to work to buy the empire in the Western world a little more time, they're not, the levers are no longer working. Do you think this is causing them to just throw any and everything that they can think of up against the wall just to see if something will stick, to give them just a little bit more time to keep the empire in the Western world afloat?
Ultimately, yes, you're right, of course. But I would say that in the depths of their minds and hearts, they are terrified people, and they know this. But at every conscious level, they are in denial. They are totally in denial. If you look at the hearings they give to Congress every day, and our top generals give to Congress, these, I love the Astro City comic books of Kurt Busiek and always have. And there's one character, spoiler alert coming up, everyone switch off here. Kurt, please forgive me. I have revered your work for more than 30 years. Everyone should read it. One of his characters, one of his greatest heroes, turns out to be a vampire. That's his own dark secret. That's the spoiler. And he's called the Confessor, and he's a priest too. Wonderfully twisted dude, right? Mm-hmm. And at one point, the Confessor is about to attack a gang of crooks and predators in the night, and they know he's out there and they're scared of him. And one of the gang leader says to the other guys, "Don't worry, guys, he can't do anything to us. We got crucifixes, we got holy water, we can protect ourselves. For certain reasons, that doesn't work." Right? But then in the darkness of the night, the Confessor says to them in his dark voice, "Who are you trying to," and it has to be Irish, of course, because any self-respecting priest in America has to be of Irish background. "Who are you trying to convince, Geraghty? Your men, them, or yourself?" And that's the answer to your question, Rashid. Joe Biden and Janet Yellen and Antony Blinken and Greg Sullivan are trying to convince themselves. They're repeating the mantra. They're repeating the principles of their faith. But their faith is not mainstream Islam. Their faith is not mainstream Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism. Their faith is arrogant American liberal internationalism and secularism. That we and we alone, because we defeated communism, these people all came of age or were running through universities full of arrogant, full of themselves. I mean, I grew up in an era of enormous self-doubt in the West. I embraced Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in my day because to me, it looked to me that they were, and they bought us time. They bought us time. Because it looked to me in the 1970s as if everything was going to go under, and every form of decent, comfortable, secure, civilized life for everybody in Europe, in Britain, and Ireland, and America was all going to go down the tubes all around the world. So I grew up in a moment of enormous insecurity. They came up in a moment of enormous security, misleading security. The Cold War had just ended, and they believed you don't need Jesus, you don't need a Mahdi, you don't need the Mahdi, you don't need the 12th Imam, you don't need the Jewish Messiah, you don't need anyone like this. You don't need Shangri-La from the Buddhist tradition. Don't need any of it. Why? Because we are doing the job already so well and so much. They really believe this. And therefore, any opposition, whether it's from Putin and President Xi all the way up there in the power of Moscow and Beijing, or you and me buried in the most recesses of the Eastern Seaboard, we're equally monstrous because we are standing in the way of the eternal salvation of the human race, which is their way. The fact that it throws the human race into destitution, poverty, drug addiction, human trafficking, enslavement, despair, existential despair. No, I mean, as long as they're doing well, Everyone else's suffering doesn't matter. And it's not that they totally, it will all pass very quickly. It will all pass very quickly. I mean, my God, even Lincoln thought this way. There is a terrifying saying Lincoln makes in 1863 before Grant comes in. And when he's already thrown away hundreds of thousands of lives, just like Zelensky in Ukraine today, the difference is there's no Ulysses S. Grant on the horizon for Ukraine. Instead, they get military advice from Biden's generals. Right? But Lincoln says all these hundreds of thousands of dead boys, fathers and husbands and beloved sons, that you're weeping for and going to lighting candles for and going to all these fake mediums for, to talk to, because you cannot bear the thought that your son died in some stinking grave in the middle of Virginia for nothing, right? It doesn't matter in the long run, because as Lincoln put it, and Lincoln had a way with words, within 50 years, and I paraphrase slightly here, but this is basically what he says, the sources of our current unhappiness will be covered over or gently smothered by time. He means that all the people who lost their sons and husbands and boyfriends and loved ones, and who will never, ever recover from the grief of it, will die themselves. Mm-hmm. And the memory of the grief will die with them, so who cares? But what will we have left? A united America. That's what really matters. You could have had a united America at a far less horrific cost than that if Lincoln had appointed Grant 2 years earlier, or if he'd listened to Winfield Scott. And Churchill had the same problem. Churchill thought he was a military genius, and he wasn't. It was when Franklin Roosevelt and the American commanders and the best British commanders took control of the war away from Churchill in 1942. Then we began to win. Then the West began to survive. But as long as Churchill was running the war, Britain and America were losing the war. And I mean, I've reached an age, Rashid, where I have learned that virtually everything is the opposite of everything I devoutly and sincerely believed for so many years, not just when I was growing up, but as an adult too. The more you look into things, the more interesting, as you well know, are the things that you find there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to go to an article that shows you, just to touch on the depths of collapse and rot and social decay that is underway within America. And we can say that this is a mirror of the Western world because it's everywhere in the Western world. And this article is on the Economic Collapse blog, and it's titled, "When People Can't Take Care of Themselves, They Start to Go Nuts." And this is my first time reading more than a sentence on it, so I won't read much, but I'm going to read enough to get you to comment on. And it says, "The rapidly growing chasm that exists between the ultra wealthy and all the rest of us is not good for our society. In recent years, our leaders flooded the system with enormous mountains of money, and all of that money greatly enriched those at the very top of the economic food chain. Unfortunately, all of that money also created tremendous amount of inflation, which has been crushing the standard of living for millions upon millions of hardworking Americans. We just witnessed the largest decline in real median household income since 2010. The childhood poverty rate in the U.S. has more than doubled, and this year homelessness is rising in our nation at the fastest pace ever recorded. So many Americans are deeply suffering right now, and we need to remember that there are real people with real emotions." What say you about this matter, especially when we go back to that government report that says that it would have only cost the U.S. $20 billion to completely eradicate homelessness across the United States, and another $20 billion to eradicate poverty? But yet they've given Zelensky upwards of $200 billion that we know of in monetary and military aid. What say you on this matter? While the standard of living, childhood poverty, homelessness, everything is just, it seems like it's snowballing. All the while the United States government can find money for war. She can find money for color revolutions. She can find money to aid and fund corrupt regimes and install them. Yet she cannot look within her own borders to find compassion enough to help the mother or the father that is struggling to pay for health care or Head Start, so that they can try to go to work to make a living to keep their family afloat.
First, I fully agree with you, of course. And secondly, we had three great and courageous leaders in our modern history who everybody pays lip service to now, who not only asked those very same questions as you just have, Rashid, but who were determined to act and change the policies of America to reach those admirable goals. And they were President John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King. And in the space of 5 years, they were all gone. And of course, it was just the rule of the gun, the tragic madness of American society. You can't do anything about these disturbed individuals. But why is it only people like JFK and RFK and Dr. King and Malcolm X, and of course there were others, who are selectively taken out by these tragic individualistic losers? And such convenient questions are still not asked to this day. The pro-American ruler of Japan for a decade was killed by a supposed nutcase last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you, in the National Security Council and the Intelligence Service of the United States, they were too piss ignorant of the modern history and culture of Japan. Japan's our ally, Japan's a democracy. All of this is true. But Japan is also its own unique nation, its own unique culture. And if you look at the pattern of political assassinations in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s, and even in the 1880s, this is a very familiar ring to it. Regime is being changed. A new empire is here. Emperor is here. After the old emperor, who was a great friend and consistent supporter of the United States for more than half a century, he's still alive, thank God, but he retired through ill health. He's very old. And the new emperor is a very able young man, and he's cautious. So far, he isn't a crazy or an adventurer. But do you think the leaders I say here, we have already lost Saudi Arabia. We have just lost South Africa, and nobody noticed. The South African military, South Africa was a key ally to the United States and Britain in both world wars. They are now having military exercises with Russia and China. They do not trust America or Britain to protect them or act in their own interests anymore. This is enormous, because this divides the world. It means the American and British and Australian sea power and air power in the Indian Ocean and in the Atlantic and Pacific are divided. They can no longer simply pass through the Cape of Good Hope or enjoy air protection from the Simonstown Air Base. Russia and China have that now. But have you read this in the New York Times? Have you read this in the Wall Street Journal? I haven't read any of me. I just missed it. Or in Bloomberg? Oh, and of course, PBS. Now, everyone take a resolution. Every time somebody mentions PBS News, respectfully, laugh uncontrollably in public. It's not worth criticizing them. There's nothing there. There's no there. But just laugh uncontrollably in public. You will be amazed at how quickly this will catch on and have a profound national effect. But it's like you said, Rashid. All this change is happening, and they are in denial about it. And they are panicking at the same time. Like Freud teaches us, the nature of cognitive dissonance, of irrational behavior. People do mutually conflicting things at the same time. So in the depths of their heart, you're absolutely right. They cannot escape what is going on, but they do not dare admit it either. And above all else, they aren't remotely capable of changing their belief system or the actions that are based on this. It's worth watching, if you can bear it, any congressional hearing for half an hour or so at any time. And listen to the mantra that is always said, especially by military leaders, and especially by our civilian military leaders. Our military leaders, even at the top levels, often try and do what the British chiefs of staff did in the 1930s. They have the thankless job of being honest men and women trying to tell truth to power. And it is never listened to. It is never appreciated. It is never taken on board. But all our secretaries of the Air Force and the Navy and Defense and this and that, we, the greatest armed forces in the history of the universe, not just of the world, but the universe. Well, duh, Genghis Khan. Well, duh, Napoleon. Well, duh, the American army wasn't bad in World War II, but of course, they just fought and won real wars, not like you guys today. Oh, well, duh, right? Duh. You are right. I mean, you've nailed it. They are in a state of cognitive dissonance, and therefore it is inevitable that things get worse. And they hurl everything that they can at the wall in a state of panic, because that is all they're capable of doing. But none of them has the guts for saying, maybe we should haul in Zelensky. Maybe we should stop the slaughter of innocent Ukrainian boys by the 100,000. Zelensky was acclaimed as being greater than Winston Churchill last December, when he visited Washington. Nancy Pelosi did not just gush on this. She wrote a letter to members of Congress comparing him to Churchill, that nothing had happened like that in Congress since Churchill had come in 1941. When in a sense that was true. Churchill came, he needed American money, he'd lost the war, and every time in the first year or two of the war, FDR made the mistake of listening to Churchill or compromising with him. Endless numbers of both British and American boys died needlessly in battles like Italy, where they never had to fight, right? General George Marshall, I think his greatest moment came in 1943. Churchill wants to put off the invasion of Europe, to liberate Europe, and open the death camps, and end the racism of Nazi Germany. Not a bad goal, right? That's FDR's goal. But Churchill's goal is, no, he's afraid, we'll be stuck down in the bloodbath like World War I. He has a much more brilliant idea. Why don't we invade the Balkan Peninsula instead? Right? And especially, why don't we invade the island of Rhodes off the shore of Greece? Because then Turkey might be so impressed they'll join the war. Now, they don't want to join the war. They don't have any modern weapons to join the war, right? They're 2,000 miles away from where the main battles are being fought. But Churchill is a genius, so he must be right. And he urges the landing on the Greek islands to General George Marshall, the U.S. Chief of Staff. And General Marshall, a figure of great honesty and integrity and dignity, replies to him, Mr. Prime Minister, not one goddamn American boy is going to die on that goddamn beach. Nobody dared to speak that way to Winston Churchill, even Franklin Roosevelt. But George Marshall did. And Churchill never forgave him for it. That was the moment when Marshall lost his chance to command the invasion of Europe, because Churchill would not let him do it. Eisenhower, who fully agreed with Marshall, but Eisenhower was very politically skillful and diplomatic. And Churchill drove Eisenhower crazy too. Eisenhower once said to one of his aides, I have just spent the last 6 hours saying no to the Prime Minister in every way possible. He still doesn't get it. That's the problem we face here. Zelensky is not different from Churchill. He's actually the same as Churchill, but this is not good. This is very bad. The wrong lessons are drawn from World War II. There are good lessons to be drawn in World War II, the best. But these are the wrong lessons. Zelensky has sent 500,000 of his own boys to die in only a year. It took the British government in World War I, one of the most inept and catastrophic war-fighting governments in human history, 3 years to throw away that number of the lives of their own boys and people. And Zelensky, with our support, has done it in 6 months to a year. And he's also he's used up 30 years of NATO weapons. So NATO is now, it took 30 years at our current rates of production for NATO to produce all the weapons that they thought they needed, and they still weren't remotely enough to deter the Russians. And they gave them to Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have wasted them and lost them. And so now NATO is unarmed against Russia. And Russia has learned how to neutralize even our best and most effective weapons. We gave them that chance against an ill-trained army free of charge. We didn't have a clue. We didn't have a clue. Zelensky could have made peace with the Russians and saved the lives of 500,000 Ukrainian boys, and he could have done it a year and a half ago. This is advice Jesus gives in the Gospels. Jesus is not usually thought of as a military analyst, but he was a brilliant one. And no wonder, because he hung out, he impressed Roman centurions and soldiers. We know lots of them followed him and were loyal to the end to him and became some of the early Christians, amazingly enough. And it's there, it's in the records. And he hangs out with them. And clearly he learns from them too, because the Roman army was the greatest fighting machine that the world had ever seen militarily to that point, right? And what does Jesus actually say in the Gospels? He said, no rabbi could have thought this way. He hung out with centurions. No one ever goes against an army of 20,000 with an army of 10,000 unless he has a plan, unless he knows what he's doing. Now, notice Jesus doesn't say, don't go against 20,000 at all with 10,000, or you're outnumbered 10 to 1 and they'll kill you. He's more subtle than that. He thinks like Sun Tzu. Jesus says, you can beat an army of 20,000 with an army of 10,000 if you know what you're doing and you don't take unnecessary risks and you don't play into their hands. And of course, it helps if they're run by idiots and you're not. But you've got to know what you're doing. He said, if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't have a plan to do it, declare peace, surrender, don't declare war. We didn't do that with the poor Ukrainians. We did what Douglas Haig did to his own armies of the British Empire. And that's what really destroyed the British Empire in World War I. We fed them into the mincing machine. So Zelensky is an angel of death. And look at the people who acclaimed him as the great savior. Should you vote for them? Should you trust them, both Republicans and Democrats alike? There's bipartisan support in Capitol Hill. I think there may have been one senator who spoke out against him. No congressman. I stand to be corrected. There are, by my count, 3 senators, all of them Republicans actually, who so far stand out against this madness. The Democrats had a wonderful presidential candidate potentially for 2004. And that was Tulsi Gabbard. Yeah. I think they're going to run Michelle Obama, but only on the condition, of course, that she follows the Biden policy. And she'll go along with the deal. She may be better on some domestic policies, but if she even tries to be honest and better, and I think she's capable of that, what happened to JFK or RFK would happen to her.
Well, that's a mic drop moment there. So I want to thank you for joining us today on this episode of the Red Pill Diaries. We're going to try to have you back when you come back in town and you have as you and I discussed behind the scenes. We'll have you back on soon. Thank you so much, Martin, for everything. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Rashid, my friend, it is a pleasure and a privilege and a joy. Thank you, my friend.
Be blessed. Everybody who's listening to the Red Pill Diaries, let me say this to each and every one of you all. I want to thank you for the time that you have allotted us at this moment to give ear to some of the things that we've said, because this world is crashing and burning, and you need the information that will put you in the best position to survive the crash. And you need to start looking at each other in a more humble way and do good, not because someone is watching you. Do good because it's the right thing to do. Because remember, ultimately, someone is watching you, and it's the supreme being. So on that note, hit the like button and subscribe, share this thing. Try to look within yourself. If you have grudges with somebody, forgive. You never know how much time you have. Time is a limited resource, and so it is an unrenewable resource also. You only have a finite amount of time. So try to better yourself in the allotted time that God has given you. Know that if you love truth, I love you, but my love will always pale in comparison to the love that the Supreme Being has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true.
Amen, brother.
Above all things, stay righteous. Mama, your baby boy loves you more than life, everybody. Deuces, and thank you all.